This is the Dallas Morning News.
I'm Talmage Boston, and welcome to this edition of Cross-Examining History, where we explore America's fascinating past with our country's leading historians and thought leaders. For this podcast, I interviewed Doug Bradburn, President and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon, to discuss his thoughts on our nation's first president, the indispensable man in the founding of our country. We did the program in front of a live audience in Dallas on May 20, 2026. Enjoy.
Well, Brad, thank you for that very generous introduction, overly generous introduction. But we're really here to be and learn from my great friend Doug Bradburn, the president and CEO of Mount Vernon. When I walked in the door this morning, I saw those little buttons that I hope you'll put on your lapel on your way out, America 250. And when I reached out to the Crow organization, I said, hey, Doug Bradburn's coming to town. Do you have space in the pecan room to have a breakfast while he's in town? The answer was yes, because we're definitely trying to promote this America 250. And I cannot think of a better way to do that than for everybody to leave this morning with a much clearer picture of George Washington, his greatness, his achievements, why he was truly the indispensable man to the founding of our country. And so no better authority than Doug to kind of cover that ground. It's been a long time since most of us were in high school or college. We've probably forgotten almost everything we ever knew about George Washington, and it's time to be reminded at this historic moment. Doug grew up in Virginia, graduated of the University of Virginia, majored in history and economics, PhD from the University of Chicago, started out as an educator, became the head of the history department at the State University of New York at Binghamton, came to Mount Vernon in 2013, the first head of the library at Mount Vernon, which is now a major presidential library, and he became the president and CEO in 2018. Everybody who I've talked to this morning, I said, how long has it been since you went to Mount Vernon? And they say, oh gosh, I was 10 years old. Or maybe they say, no, it was 10 years ago. But whatever it was, you need to go back. I suspect everybody in this room goes to D.C. pretty often, and Mount Vernon is close, and it is so spectacular in every respect. It will energize your patriotism like nothing else that I've found. That's why I love to go back as frequently as we do, because there's always just something magical about that. So without any further introduction, please welcome Doug Bradburn. Thank you. All right, so we're going to cover the waterfront, cradle to grave almost, Doug. But from his earliest days, Washington had a thirst for distinction. Like his Mount Rushmore compadre, Abraham Lincoln, he wanted to be esteemed by his fellow men and to do things that made him worthy of their esteem. So what was it that put that ferocious inner drive into Washington's DNA?
Well, first, thank you, Talmage, so much for having me here, and thanks to the Crow organization. This is a beautiful place. My first time at Old Parkland, and all you ever hear is, oh, you're going to love it, and you know, I hear that a lot, but this is really special and an inspiring venue to speak about this. It's a very good question Talmage presents us with, is why do people have the drive that they have? You think about, when you do the big, the sporting events where you have to pick teams and you got to pick people to be on your team, and you say, well, that guy's a good locker room guy. He's got that engine. He's got that motor. How do you get that motor? You can't teach that. And in some ways, it is a mystery why a person is driven, but he was clearly driven. George Washington was driven at a young age. He had that ambition to be something, to make something of himself. His father dies when he's 11 years old. And I think that puts into him a certain urgency. Later on in life, he'll talk about how the Washington men are short-lived. His brother eventually dies young. His grandfather had died young. There's this sense that he doesn't have time to waste. So, this is a deeper psychological question, and maybe we can come back to it and get to it as we talk more about that. But his motivations, like all great men, are fascinating, but they ultimately, it is in the depths of their psyche.
I mean, de Tocqueville talked about in young America this longing to rise. Let me give you some details on the young Washington. And that is, before he's 20 years old, people who are around him already say, he has the manners of a gentleman. He has toughness that is earned from being a surveyor. He has a quiet confidence. There's never an arrogance. He became Virginia militia's major who commanded the colony's southern district. And he owned 4,000 acres in the West and wrote a journal that was published and circulated around the world about his dealings with the threatening French and Indians on the American frontier. Now, those are impressive traits and accomplishments for anybody of any age. Washington had done all this by the time he's a teenager. So maybe it's an unanswerable question, but to connect all those dots at such a young age and be where he was before he even entered his 20th decade is like, I have a daughter who's 35. I have a son who's 38. The idea that he would accumulate 4,000 acres and do all this kind of stuff is...
Wow. Yeah, it's harsh on your kids. You just call them out there. But, I wouldn't have done it. I mean, because Washington has such an incredible life, we don't know that young life is extraordinary. But, people don't even have time to think about, get into that. But it's critical to making the man who he's going to become. His father dies, like I said. He doesn't get a formal education. He's got reading, writing, and arithmetic, when he's 11 years old. He's not going to get the polished, gentlemanly education that his half-brothers got in England. At the Appleby School in England, they learned Latin, they learned a little Greek, they learned rhetoric, they learned the polish of to be a gentleman. Now, his older half-brother came back, and he connected him with some very polished men in Virginia, the Fairfax family. Lord Thomas Fairfax, the only English peer that lived in the colonies. A massive landholder himself, and an opportunity for George Washington, if he could prove himself to this man, that he was worthy. And so, so he doesn't get that polish as a gentleman, and he knows he doesn't have it. And so that insecurity is driving him. So in some ways, you're going to be the best gentleman, to show that you fit in. He has this great rules of civility. As Talmage knows, this little book of rules and manners of civility, which is 110 rules. Some of them are like, don't put your elbow on the table while you're eating. Bow your head to the more prestigious men in the room. One of them is, the last one is extraordinary, is always retain in your breast a sacred fire known as conscience. But these are rules that teach you how to behave, to show that you know how to behave, because he has to have other people think that he can be deserving of opportunity. When your father's dead, you have no great patron. So your reputation in the 18th century is what people think it is. This is way before Sigmund Freud. There's no internal life. It is, you are what people think you are. So if people think you're a drunk, you're a drunk. If they think you're unreliable, you're unreliable. It isn't like, if they only knew the real me, He has to project this kind of persona to get advantage. There's no SAT scores. There's no civil service scores. It's all about being available when that opportunity, is being given out and being a person that you trust.
First impressions are everything.
Absolutely.
You don't get two chances to make a great first impression.
Right.
So now let's talk about in his 20s. And he begins his military career in supporting the British-American effort during the French and Indian War. And his record was largely undistinguished, marked more by setbacks than triumphs. And yet, during the war, he emerges as Virginia's leading military figure, a man of destiny, a stranger to fear, and blessed by the gods that he survived. So how did he gain such stature and public acclaim during the war without earning victories on the battlefield?
Well, that extraordinary point, because his first great service ends in defeat. He loses an army at Fort Necessity early on in the French and Indian War before it even had a name. He's taking a quickly put together group of men out to rush out to try to seize the forks of the Ohio River, and the French are heading there as well. He gets into a small skirmish, which he wins, but it kind of turns into chaos. He can't control his native allies. He eventually is going to be chased down by this larger French army, and he encamps in Fort Necessity and surrenders it. He surrenders his whole post. So that looks to be the end, Talmage. But he recovers from that, and he's given an opportunity to serve again in Braddock's March. Another military disaster, one of the greatest military disasters in English history. This is General Edward Braddock, takes an army from Alexandria, Virginia, marches straight all the way out to what's now Pittsburgh, and they carve out a road. And eventually they get ambushed and destroyed. But George Washington, serving as an aide-de-camp, saves the day. He saves that army, leads them off the battlefield, and keeps them from being destroyed. And that is what gives him his great reputation. That act of heroism, which saves the army from complete defeat. Braddock gives him his sash, his family's military sash, as he's dying. We own that sash at Mount Vernon today. It has Braddock's blood on it. It's incredible. And this thing Washington kept his whole life, and that taught him a lot about what real war was like, what courage was like, and what leadership was about. And he would go on to have many other successes, actually, in the French and Indian War. But for him, it was a very bittersweet experience because he did not get the preferment that he wanted.
I mean, for the people who are religious in this room, the story of his career in the French and Indian War confirms that an almighty providence was looking over George Washington, ultimately our indispensable man, because he had horses shot out from under him. He had bullet holes in his hats, in his uniforms. Everybody else gets killed. He survives.
Yeah.
So for him to survive was a providential miracle.
That was the Braddock defeat, where he wrote his brother. The reason we know he wrote his brother about the bullet holes in his hat, holes in his coat, 2 horses shot from under him. 60 officers were wounded at that event. He's one of the few that didn't get wounded in it. And in fact, there was a Presbyterian minister in Virginia after that who talked about, God's hand was on young Colonel Washington. And also there was a Native American group that told the story. And this is before the Revolution in the 1770s, that they had shot at him directly many times, and they thought that he must have been protected by the Great Spirit because they couldn't hit him. And that's a true story that was told to him, long before he becomes the famous George Washington we know today.
So right after he completes his military service in the French and Indian War, he encounters Martha Custis, and they have a torrid 9-day courtship that resulted in a quick wedding and a long and happy marriage. So describe their instant and permanent mutual attraction.
Well, Martha Washington was the wealthiest widow in Virginia at the time, so she was an extremely attractive woman right away to George Washington.
She was born on third base.
Now, she was an extraordinary woman. She had 2 children from her first marriage. She's 26 years old. And so she's got all kinds of suitors. So she chooses George Washington. He's the one, he's the military hero. He's going to be in his military uniform, his dashing uniform. He's 6'2". He's muscular. He's well regarded. He's a man of parts.
He's a good dancer.
He's a beautiful dancer like you, Talmage. I mean, he can really move across the dance floor. And you need to have a ball in this room. This is really quite extraordinary. But so it clearly is a great match because they do have a long, successful, supportive life together. We don't get the George Washington we know today without Martha Washington. She brings not only wealth, and that means opportunity into his world, but she really brings a confidence to a young man who in many ways had been insecure, had been overly ambitious, kind of too forward in some ways, had been impolitic occasionally. And Martha, I think, gives him that quiet confidence that we know to kind of associate with George Washington.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the period between 1759, when he ends his service in the French and Indian War, until 1775 when he takes over as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army in the American Revolution. So that's 16 years when he was a farmer, a businessman, a real estate speculator, a legislator, a judge, and a community leader. So what happened in those 16 years, 1/4 of his life, between the two wars that advanced him toward his goal of obtaining distinction and renown?
Yeah. Well, from his perspective, he marries Martha Washington and he abandons the idea of a military career. It was bittersweet because he was never recognized by the British Empire, by the crown, as an officer of the crown. He always served as a provincial officer of the colony of Virginia. And that meant he was unequal to all the British officers. So even a captain with a British commission could command a colonel in the provincial commission. So he was incredibly frustrated, and it was really the first leg of the stool that fell on his desire to remain in the British Empire, was that frustration. He wrote, "I cannot understand why Americans don't have the same rights as British subjects." He wrote that in 1756. That's 20 years before the Declaration of Independence. So with Martha and the marriage there, he's going to turn his ambitions to being a true Virginia planter, a Virginia gentleman, and he's going to serve in the way that leaders in the community had done for 100 years in the colony of Virginia. In your vestry, in your church, you're going to become a justice of the peace. You'll represent the county in the House of Burgesses. You'll be a great man in the sense of the 18th century. And that's what his ambition was, and his particular passion was agriculture.
Now, from 1775, when he's named the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, until 1783, the end of the Revolution, Washington lost more battles than he won. And yet, during those 8 years, he maintained his top leadership position and his status as a hero to the American people. So again, how does he keep maintaining this stature while he's losing most of his battles?
Yeah, you got the wrong perspective entirely on George Washington, Talmage.
It's accurate, but it's wrong.
I think it's a good question. I mean, he gets the appointment as commander-in-chief of the Army because in large part, he does have some of the most military experience in the Continental Congress, certainly, and in the colonies in 1775 when the Continental Congress is appointing that leader. And he's also a Virginian. And the Army and the cause in some ways is seen as a Massachusetts problem. Boston is the annoying city that, you've been there, you understand. And that's how the British felt too. So they figured we can just isolate New England. But, the Adams brother, the Adams, Samuel and John Adams, one of their brilliant strokes is we get a Virginian in charge of that army, it becomes a national affair. And so, but then he proved it. He proved that he was a man who could build this army from scratch. And his first great victory, of course, was kicking the British out of Boston. I mean, you want to jump, you don't want me to give long answers, and then you want to talk about the whole war, and you want to jump ahead.
But see, I know you're really smart, and you can really streamline your answers.
Yeah, I mean, the answer was, he was a winner. He won the war. He understood the difference between battles and wars. He never lost an army. He had that experience in the French and Indian War. Don't lose the army. The army was the cause embodied, the cause of independence ultimately embodied. If you lose that army, you lose the whole thing. And a great strategist understands logistics. They think about politics. They think about how to manage those things. He's the greatest political general America's probably ever had until Eisenhower, on a different scale. It was inspired by Washington's example. And the politics of that war was as hard as anything to do with the tactics on the battlefield. And he won that. He's really one of America's great politicians because we don't even think about him as a politician. And yet he never lost an election, when he was in the United States, and really won everything unanimously. So it was his politics, his savvy, his ability. You look at Lincoln, how many generals did he have to go through before he could win the Civil War? The Americans only had the one. And he sent home 5 British generals, all who'd won acclaim in Europe? That's pretty extraordinary.
In terms of holding the army together, all our lives we've heard about Washington's leadership of the Continental Army during the winter at Valley Forge from December 77 until June 78. So how bad was it? And why was it instrumental to the Army's turnaround?
Well, it's too bad you turned the fire off here because it's so cold outside. You could really appreciate the Valley Forge feel. But it's a brutally cold winter, and the troops have no clothes. When you say
No shoes.
They're naked in the 18th century, that means you don't have shoes. You maybe have one raggy blanket. You barely have a shirt. You don't have coats.
You're sleeping on the ground.
Well, they're sleeping on the ground, and they don't have food. And so they have to scavenge for food in the countryside. In the same time, they're right on the border of the enemy lines. The enemy are in Philadelphia. The British Army is in Philadelphia, and they have hard money to pay the local farmers for their food. So the Continental Army's got nothing but their promises. And so there's a huge conflict over whether this cause is even going to survive. This cause is lost. The army is disintegrating. Men are dying of starvation, of disease, of hardship. And Washington stays there the whole time with this army. There's no 18th century general in Europe that's staying with an army in this state. It's unheard of. You go to winter quarters, generals go off, they go to somewhere nice. He's right there with them the whole time, doing his job. So it's a brutal, brutal winter. And that perseverance, I think is the highest form of courage. It's one thing to be courageous in battle in that moment to step forward, but it's another to be courageous in the face of a cause that's a losing and nagging, daily, constant loss. And that courage of George Washington was that hard metal of iron that he had that really kept this cause alive at a time when patriotism is dead. Patriotism is only ever going to get you so far. You need perseverance, courage, vision, and of course, managing the interests of all the different parties involved. So he had that skill.
Now, another great example of him holding the army together, after the British had surrendered at Yorktown, we needed to maintain an army, but since our soldiers still hadn't been paid by Congress, Washington faced what appeared to be a mutiny at what's known as the Newburgh Conspiracy. So he saved that day with a dramatic presentation to his troops that prevented the mutiny. So paint a word picture of that powerful moment.
So it's March 15th, 1783. The army is in Newburgh, New York. The officer corps is there. They're angry. They're furious. They haven't been paid. Many of them have served for 8 years. They know the war is over. The announcement has come that there's going to be peace and the treaty is just being hammered out. And so they know when that treaty arrives in North America, they don't need the army anymore. And so they're going to be sent home. And what are they going to be sent home with? Nothing. So they have right now some leverage. They've got the guns in their hands. And so the argument is, and some of that argument is coming from the Continental Congress itself, this is the moment to seize the opportunity to force Congress to get you paid. Tell them you will not lay down your arms until you're paid. Even march on Congress. And there's petitions circulating amongst the officer corps. Do not trust the man that urges moderation in this moment. And they were right. I mean, these are the officers that had sacrificed the most, their blood. Their friends have died. Their families are impoverished. In some cases, their farms have been burnt to the ground by loyalists or by the British. And they've got nothing to go home to. And Washington gets word of this movement in the camp. There's going to be a secret meeting of the officers. And he says, well, look, it won't be a secret meeting. We'll have a meeting. We'll let the officers meet. And you can put your grievances together. And we'll air your grievances. But what they don't know is he shows up to that meeting. It's in a building that the officers call the Temple of Virtue because they think they're the only virtuous men in America. And they show up in that. He shows up that meeting. He goes up to the front. He has Henry Knox, who's the big fat head of artillery, bar the door, and he gives a prepared speech, what we call the Newburgh Address. And in that speech, he talks about how these men would lose all the honor and all the liberty that they had won. All the honor they had gained and all the liberty they've won if they do this thing. If they march on Congress, who they serve. Congress are their masters. And if they overturn Congress, they overturn the whole purpose of what they've been fighting for. And the men sort of shuffle their feet. And And then Washington does an extraordinary thing. He pulls out a letter from a congressman and he can't read it. It's small script, it's not his own hand. So he pulls out, what does he pull out? He pulls out his spectacles. And he looks at them and says, man, I know you've suffered. I've not only gone gray, but blind in the service of this nation. And he puts on his spectacles. He reads the letter. And it's a letter which tells him to wait, that Congress is trying. Just hold on, we're trying to get you paid. And there's not a dry eye in the House. And so Washington then leaves, and the officers pass a resolution saying they will obey the commands of Washington and lay down their arms when he asks. It saves the American Revolution from turning into what so many other promising revolutions have, which is a military dictatorship. It's how the English Civil War ended, when Cromwell marches into Parliament and says, you have sat too long here. He declares himself Lord Protector. Napoleon crowns himself emperor. Stalin, I don't even have to tell you the rest of that story. I think Arlen's got his statue somewhere in his yard. All these dictators and generalissimos who saved the revolution because they're the only one. And Washington had every reason to say, I'm the only one who can make sure this revolution will end well. But he didn't do that. And it saved this country and made us into a country based on the rule of law.
Mm-hmm. So this problem of dysfunctional Congress, they can't figure out how to pay troops and so forth, was the story of the American government during the Articles of Confederation. And so it's time, we've got to do something different. We've got to have a constitutional convention, which they have in 1787 in Philadelphia. Madison persuades Washington to come, and then once he comes, he is unanimously chosen to preside as chairman over the Constitution. So here's a hypothetical question. Assume Washington had never gone to the Constitutional Convention. What would have happened?
Well, we wouldn't all be sitting here today together. We wouldn't have had a union. It would have fallen apart. The Constitution never would have been ratified. And in fact, half the people that ended up as the framers of the Constitution wouldn't have gone either. Washington's presence was critical to that. I mean, even with Washington going, some of the great men of the Revolution refused to go to Philadelphia. Patrick Henry famously said, I smelt a rat. He wasn't going to go. Think about conspiracy theories and how we think about what's going on behind closed doors. The secret cabal of these leaders of all the states have got together. Nobody knows what's going on. They're there all summer in Philadelphia. What are they doing? There's no news media. There's all closed doors. If George Washington wasn't in that room, there would be no trust at all of what they came up with. And when they came out with that Constitution was circulated in the United States everywhere with a big letter at the top of it written by George Washington, president of the Constitutional Convention, saying that this was a hard-earned effort to improve the government of the United States, and it deserved a fair hearing by the American people. Everywhere the Constitution was first seen, Washington's endorsement of that work was there, because he was the man that everybody could trust, because he had given up power. He had resigned his commission at the end of the war. He hadn't seized the reins of power. And so without him, I don't think we get a Constitution. We certainly don't get it then, and we certainly don't have the history that we know.
Well, I hope that for everybody who's in this room, as you go back to your families, your children, your grandchildren, we get closer to the 4th of July, and the name George Washington comes up, you are able to better explain why he was the indispensable man. We do not win the revolution without him. We do not have a constitution without him. Of course, we don't start the government with him as our first president without him. So to me, those are the key points as to why he's so worthy. Here we are 250 years later talking about him. But back to his amazing story. As you mentioned, he didn't have much formal education. He was an autodidact, self-taught, a great reader. In his early years, he struggled with word precision, but because he's reading the great plays and literature, he develops a vocabulary and a word precision. What were the specifics of what he did to improve his word power?
Yeah, he's extraordinarily self-aware at a precocious age of his weaknesses, and that's critical for anybody trying to improve anything. But his correspondence is an incredible school for him, because he's writing official letters at the age of 21. He writes his journal, as you know, that gets published. and he's embarrassed about that because he doesn't have time to polish it from his basically rough notes. So through practice and correspondence, his correspondence is one of the largest in American history. I mean, it transcribed now 90 volumes of letters that he read and wrote, which aren't complete yet. We've been transcribing them and publishing them since 1968. It'll be complete in 2028. So it's an extraordinary learning by doing example. But you're right, he's reading books.
Yeah, talk about his library.
Well, one of the great things we have at Mount Vernon, when we opened the Presidential Library in 2013, we've been reconstructing all the books that George Washington owned. In some cases, we have a lot of the originals. But when we can't get the originals, we try to get the exact edition of the book he owned. It's not always the best edition of the book ever published, but it's the one he owned. And it gives a window into the man who, I would say, he doesn't inherit somebody else's library. He doesn't buy a whole library. Each of these books tells a story of a need that he's trying to fill. So the earliest books are books on travel and kind of adventure, what we'd call them. Books on mathematics when he's learning to be a surveyor. He becomes a military officer. He's buying books on military science. He gets really into agriculture. He's buying the latest books on what's called the new way of agriculture coming from Great Britain. Gets really into that movement. Then he starts, adding in political philosophy. At the time, the conversations about constitutional rights in the empire. Eventually adds bell letters to that mix. And throughout his life, you see him referencing books and encouraging readers. I'll give one final little quick anecdote on this. Is the American Revolutionary War, many officers are writing him saying, I've never done this before. I don't know how to be an officer. And Washington writes back with a list of books. Read these 5 books and practice. It's like prepare, practice and read. And you learn by reading and by doing. And that's very much example of his story.
And in these books at the Mount Vernon Library, he's writing notes in the margins. So you can see his whole thought process as he's reading these books. Now,
he corrects the grammar in the books. and one of my favorites is he's got this book on practical navigation. It's the same book Benjamin Franklin learned from practical navigation. And he corrects the chart in the back that helps you figure out the declination of the sun because they printed they kind of reprinted the same chart for March and April of the year. And he corrected it, and then he corrected the formula in the it's unbelievable. I mean, he was a very meticulous.
So whoever picked up,
I think he was a pain in the butt. I mean, honestly.
So whoever picked up the book after he put it down, it would be corrected. He didn't want everybody else to read.
That's right.
Inaccurate information.
Yeah, he would correct little typos and errata.
Like he's a proofreader.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
So, by all accounts, and you've touched on this, but one of his greatest traits as a leader was that he had the capacity to inspire trust. And yet, he wasn't a great public speaker. He actually had a rather soft, breathy voice that was tied to some kind of childhood respiratory illness, probably. He was reluctant to debate. So what did he do that caused so many people to trust him and be inspired by his leadership if it's not his voice and his orations?
This is a great question, which I love, and you need me to be short, so I'm going to try to be short. But I'll tell you what, he played the role of the leader that people wanted to see leading. So his favorite play, as you know, was Cato. Joseph Addison's great play Cato about the last days of the Roman Republic, where Cato kills himself at the end of the play rather than serve under Caesar. And this play was really powerful to many of the founders of the country. So give me liberty or give me death, that's out of the play, Cato. Nathan Hale, when he's executed, I have only one life. My only regret is I only had one life to give for my country. That's in the play Cato. George Washington had Cato performed at Valley Forge by the officers. He had them perform the play. He would often quote from the play. He would say, every post is honorable when the cause is worthy. Or, 'tis not in mortals to command success, Sempronius. You can do better, you can deserve it. Deserving success, meriting success. George Washington's not going to be an orator, but he's going to play the role of the selfless leader who is giving away power, who's serving the common good rather than the personal interest. He makes a big show when he accepts his commission from Congress. He's not going to take a salary from Congress. He's going to serve for the common good, and he's going to lay down his commission when the job is done. He tells them that when he gets the job. He also says, I don't think I'm worthy of the job. So that performance of humility, but also that projection of power. And on the other side of the scale, he looks the soldier. He's commanding. He knows that he can move. You said he was a great dancer. He knows how to move in a room.
He's a great horseman.
Jefferson calls him the greatest horseman of the age. He breaks his own horses. He's always at the kill in the fox hunt, which means running through broken country galloping as fast as you can on horses that he broke himself. I mean, he is in command. And so, when he is president and he visits places like Boston, that horrible town we talked about, I mean, he rides there in a carriage, but he gets out of the carriage before he enters the town. He gets on a big white horse, because that's what people want to see. They want to see him commanding. And so they don't need him to give a florid speech. He's representing the cause, and he's representing the kind of leadership that people want in this new Republican world, a leadership based on merit, a leadership that's based on service to the public good and not service to yourself, and not based on hereditary rule. And so Washington is that role model of American leadership that people want.
Mm-hmm. So now moving on to his presidency, of course, in his cabinet, he chooses Alexander Hamilton to be his Secretary of Treasury. He chooses Thomas Jefferson to be his Secretary of State. Now, in recent years, there's a national obsession with Alexander Hamilton, thanks to Ron Chernow and Lin-Manuel Miranda. And of course, Jefferson's always, here we are, 250 Declaration of Independence. He's always had a big following. And these guys didn't get along, shall we say. So when these two arch enemies are in the same room with the great unifier, George Washington, give us your impression of the dynamic. How did he keep the egos in check that allowed his cabinet to function?
Yes, well, he invented the idea of the cabinet being a deliberative body, because in the Constitution, it only says that you can from time to time request written advice from the executive officers. But he understood enough about leadership in times of crisis that he needed them together. So, he first starts meeting regularly during moments of crisis where they'll come together, and he'd let them air out their different point of views. He required them to debate, essentially, the different points of the action. What should we do, gentlemen? And they'd hear each other out, and then he would ask for their opinions in writing, and he would ultimately make a decision. In fact, when you look at both Hamilton and Jefferson writing about what was Washington like as a leader, they talked about his extraordinary judgment, that he would listen to every side, that he had no interest with any man, and that when he decided, they would move forward without, going back. So on the one hand, a very deliberative model of decision-making based on the idea that you're not the smartest guy in the room. You want the smartest people in the room advising you. And then you want to make a decision that you can get everybody to kind of, own.
Isn't it amazing what good things happen when the president knows that he is not the smartest person in the room?
That's what you need.
Isn't that a good state of affairs?
Great leaders know that. Yeah, I mean, if you don't want that. You want to be surrounded by really smart people who have different points of view. I mean, he had a very diverse cabinet in the 18th century sense, diverse regions, diverse backgrounds, diverse professions, expertise, personalities. But I will say, he was extremely frustrated because they literally got to a point where they couldn't work together, and they hated each other, and they thought the other person was going to destroy the country. I mean, so it wasn't just like a personality problem. It was, Jefferson is a dangerous man. He's, this limousine liberal. He's full of it. He's got all these fancy ideas. He's going to destroy the nation, throw us into the hands of the French. And Jefferson's looking at Hamilton. It's like all you're doing is helping out your Wall Street friends. You're screwing the common man. You got no programs for the common people, and you're in the pocket of the British, and you want to set up a monarchy like the British had. You're a dangerous man. And Washington would write them letters saying, until we're governed by angels, you have to allow for differences of opinion, and encouraging them that, that you have to assume that you don't know the outcome of every policy. Sometimes we have to try things and then learn from our mistakes.
And so as part of that divide during that first term, we have our first political parties, which Washington hates. And so at the end of the first term, he wants to go home to Mount Vernon and put all this discord behind. And yet everybody says, no, you can't do that or this thing really will fall apart. And so he is persuaded to accept a second term again unanimously.
He tries to retire after 2 years. And they're like, you can't. This thing is not going to last without you. He tries to retire after 4. That's not going to happen. By the time it's 6 years in, he's like, he's got a second-tier cabinet at that point. It looks like it's really on its last legs. And so finally he's able to quit after 2 terms. And of course, he creates the engine that goes on, which is our incredible story. So,
what do you regard as his greatest achievements during his 8-year presidency?
Well, he invented the office of the presidency. That in and of itself may sound obvious or easy, but in fact, he had no guideposts. There were no presidential historians. There were no Talmage Boston to read all his advice on how to be a great president. It had never been done before. Certainly on the scale to hold the country together. When the British tried to get order and to the colonies, they created a rebellion. And Washington, even in his presidency, is going to have insurrections because of the policies, tax revolts. How do you keep this thing together when these people are so hard to rule? So inventing the office of the presidency, inventing in practice the differences between the executive branch and the legislative branch, cannot take any of that for granted. It's extraordinary. But I think the greatest legacy that he gave us ultimately is that he resigned after 2 terms in the presidency. He walked away. He could have been elected until he died. He won unanimously in the Electoral College. There was nobody else that would ever have beaten him in any kind of election. But he didn't die in office. And he showed that presidents were mere citizens. They could go back to the people. That creates the whole model of the idea of the public servant. In the British representative system, there's no sense of public servant. You are elected, and then you are corrupt. You're corrupt, and you give sinecures to all your friends. You give appointments. You put a bunch of vicars in all these areas over here. It is all about power. And the American model that Washington sets up is the idea that you go back to the citizenry as a normal citizen after you're president of the United States. It's an incredible legacy to show that we would be a country based on laws and not of men.
But before he leaves, he decides, I need to communicate a farewell address.
Yeah.
So what inspired him? Again, he's setting precedents. Never been a prior president, but here he is. I want to make a farewell address. Why did he do it, and what were the high points of it?
Well, one of the secrets about George Washington, I just talked about his greatness in stepping away. He was really good at resigning in style. So when he left the French and Indian War, the Virginia regiment that he commanded, he left them with a farewell address to the officers, which laid out kind of like what they should be doing when they went away. And he walked away to a private situation, no more to serve the public way. He does it at the end of the American Revolutionary War. He sends a great letter to all the governors of the states. It's called his legacy. It's a circular letter to the states with all this great advice in it. And he does it again in the farewell address to the nation at the end of the presidency. This idea of, I've served you for 40 years. Here's some of the lessons I've learned that I think are critical. The farewell address is a fascinating, incredible document. The main takeaway is it's all about union. Without union, you will not have liberty. Do not let your union be destroyed by factions, by foreign power, by your own selfishness. Union is going to be critical for that liberty that you prize. But the other part of it was about local, like recent legislation. But ultimately, it's a message to us. One of the great things about the way he managed the creation of the presidency was that he understood that he was creating precedents. I walk on untrodden ground, he said. Everything I do is subject to 2 interpretations. Everything I do is making a precedent. So he's talking about the 40-year news cycle, not the 24-hour news cycle. He's thinking about us. And that farewell address is his message to us. So if you want to know what he thinks about what we're up to today, reflect on the farewell address and how it speaks to, with wisdom, some of the ongoing pressures that he saw in his own time that are endemic to this American system of free, crazy, angry people trying to get along. And he's warning us, without some sense of conciliation and awareness that this is a fragile experiment that has not succeeded in human history, without us being aware of that, it will not succeed here.
Mm-hmm. It's a good thing he didn't agree to a third term. Lots of people wanted him to do it because he, in fact, didn't live another 4 years. He only lived 2.5 years before he died in 1799 at Mount Vernon. So during that time, he wrestled with what had been a lifelong struggle in his own mind, what to do about slavery. You couldn't possibly, in that era, run a big plantation and grow crops and do everything else. There was no other labor force except slavery. And of course, slavery at that time was legal. And yet, he, like so many of the founders, knew it was wrong, knew it was immoral, et cetera, knew what the language of the Declaration of Independence said about all men created equal. So how did Washington in his final days achieve a resolution of what to do about slavery in his own life?
Yeah, it's an incredible journey for a man who grew up when slavery's legal all over the Atlantic world, when he inherits people when he's 11 years old, when his father dies. Slavery is everywhere in the world he grows up in. And of course, it's also in the Bible, and it's also in that ancient Roman history that they all love. So slavery is part of their universe, their cultural universe. And he has this great awakening about the immorality of slavery during the course of the American Revolutionary War. In no time before the Revolutionary War do you see any hint that he thinks this system is a problem for the future, an immoral system. It is the system that they have in the world he lives in. The revolution opens his eyes, I think, in great ways, and his ability to change is a critical aspect. By the 1780s, after the war, Lafayette and others are challenging him to lead the way to end slavery. Washington says he believes slavery should be ended, but it needs to be ended by legislation in the 1780s, and that he means, in that case, the state of Virginia. And you'll remember at that time, you've got free womb laws being passed in Pennsylvania in 1780. The revolution is the great break between what become the free states and the slave states in our history. You don't have free states before the revolution. They don't exist. Everywhere has slavery. Massachusetts frees their slaves in a court case that was brought by enslaved people. And what they used was the Constitution of the new state of Massachusetts, which said that all men are created equal in their Bill of Rights in their state constitution, and the judge declared that therefore slavery was illegal. And it ended slavery for 10,000 people in Massachusetts in 1782. So this movement of these northern states is happening in the 1780s. You're getting a rising group of free African Americans emerging because of this, that also now are going to have a political voice in this system in the free states. You get states like Pennsylvania, which are gradual manumission laws, which mean basically that people born in slavery will be free when they reach the age of 25 or 21, depending on how it's written. And that looks like what's going to happen in Virginia in the 1780s. There's a movement happening for it. There's an abolition society in Virginia. George Washington, as these Quakers are visiting him in Mount Vernon, they all leave thinking he's on their team. And the Constitutional Convention happens. And that convention is a compromise about the issue of slavery, and it slows some of the momentum towards abolition, which had been happening in some of the mid-Atlantic. Washington, in his own plantation in Mount Vernon, he knows as president he's not going to lead an anti-slavery effort because it would destroy the Union. He knew that. He fundamentally knew that because he'd been at the Constitutional Convention where South Carolina and Georgian delegates said, we will not join this union if the Congress has any control over slavery. So he knows that when he's president. But even then, in 1793, he's beginning plans to try to figure out how to emancipate the people at Mount Vernon. He's creating a plan. He wants to try to transition them to free employees. The problem he ultimately has to do that in his lifetime is he doesn't own everybody who's enslaved at Mount Vernon. A big chunk of them are owned by the Custis estate. So Martha Washington's first husband's estate, they're going to go to her heirs. He has no legal rights to free them. He tries to purchase them in 1796, as in the last year of his presidency, but the heirs aren't willing to sell. And so ultimately he's never, and the problem is they've all intermarried. So these are all families, and he can't figure out kind of how to end slavery for some, but not for others. Ultimately, he does it in his last will and testament when he dies. He writes it in 1799. Everyone that he owned are given freedom. They're given pensions for life. The ones who are too young to work are given training in a trade, and his estate are paying out those pensions until the 1850s. But Martha Washington's first husband's slaves go to her heirs, and they're separated and all over. So it's a tale of America, Mount Vernon. The challenge of slavery is happening on that estate. The people who are enslaved there make their lives possible, make their great achievements possible. It's a story of emancipation. There's a day of Jubilee at George Washington's death at Mount Vernon. And the people who are freed there are the core of the free black community that's still there at Gum Springs in Mount Vernon. So it's a critical part of our history that we teach every day at Mount Vernon, and we teach it in a way that hopefully contextualizes this 18th century world and helps us understand who we've become today.
Mm-hmm. We have time for a few questions. Anybody have a question of Doug? Yes, sir. Would you stand up so everybody can hear you?
More a question around your opinion. My thought also has always been that one of the most important elements of Washington is that he was a Virginian, as opposed to one of those horrible people from Boston.
That's what John Adams thought.
Yeah, and Virginia was kind of the Texas of that time, in my opinion. and so how would you comment on the importance of his Virginia heritage and citizenship?
Yeah, well, Virginia is the largest colony by wealth and population by far. And they have the largest claims to the land in North America by any others, because they got their old charters that go back to John Smith, in the 17th century. Adams has a funny line about Virginians. He said, well, all Virginian geese are swans, and these Virginian gentlemen at the Constitutional Convention with their lace shirts, and their highfalutin ways, their pretense towards aristocracy. They're an aristocracy in their command of men, these great estates, and their wealth, compared to these New England guys, who are, there's equality of property in New England on a level nowhere seen in the English-speaking world at that time. I mean, it's democratical by nature, by society. And so Virginia has more of that hierarchy and disparity, from obviously people poor and enslaved, indentured servants, criminal servants, poor white trash, all the way up. And New England, particularly urban New Englanders, are a different breed. So it's critical that they get the Virginians on board. I think one of the things that's surprising is that the Virginians are actually pretty forward in their interest in independence, for different reasons entirely than what people in Boston are worried about. But they are, in a sense, the Texas of the time. I mean, they're willing to go it alone. I mean, they are not timid revolutionaries. George Washington is not a moderate revolutionary. He's willing to arm his own men and march to Boston when he shows up at the Continental Congress in 1775. He leads the effort to create the non-importation agreement, the association, which is going to be the thing that leads to tarring and feathering and leads to the aggressive enforcement of non-consumption agreements. So the Virginians, ironically, were actually very forward in the revolution itself. There were other Southerners who were more timid, in South Carolina particularly, where they had a black majority, where they thought, the force of the British Empire to defend their interests, and it was a very different dynamic. So the Virginians were critical. And of course, when we think about early American history, the Virginians, as a Virginian, we can say, look at our first presidents, right? You have Washington, and then of course you have Adams in there, that Bostonian. But then what do you have? You have Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. You have the Virginia dynasty, essentially, that govern, and Virginia is going to be that massive state with the most electoral votes for a very, very long time.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Harlan.
Yeah, my comment is I don't like it when people make speeches at these events, but I've got to say that having served on the board of Monticello for several years, what Doug has done at Mount Vernon sets Mount Vernon's always been set apart. It's Washington, okay. But still, what Doug Bradburn has done at Mount Vernon in the last 15 years sets it apart in the country. It's massively different. And your leadership, Doug, is the reason for that. And so we need to salute you.
Oh, my God. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to close because it's about time to close.
I mean, I need to say something to that. You know? I mean, that's worth coming across the country to hear that from Harlan Crow. I mean, that's an extraordinary compliment. I appreciate that so much. You know, this place is so inspiring because, you know, we take for granted the heritage that's all around you here. This Lincoln Room with Washington miniatures in it. I mean, these things for every Americans need to know. This is, you know, part of your heritage, and to have it as a part of your you know, your corporate life, your business life, your world, your culture. It's something not to be gainsaid. It's important. And what Harlan's done, preserving these kinds of places and beautifying them with stories about who we are as a people, it's really important. You know, it's really important for us to maintain that sense. And that's, you know, what the passion of the mission at Mount Vernon is, to preserve that place for generations so that everybody can go there and learn their own special connection to this long story that we share. So I don't like speeches either, but I appreciate that one particularly. And I only wish my wife was here to hear it. So thank you.
Well, one of my favorite memories of the last 20 years was when David McCullough was in town in 2014. We got through doing a program over at the Frontiers of Flight Museum talking about his Wright brothers book. And he happened to have some free time in the afternoon. I asked him if he wanted to come see Old Parkland, which he jumped on the opportunity. And so Harlan and Ann Raymond gave David and Rosalie McCullough and my wife and I were here for a tour, and he was blown away, as all of you are, as anybody is with any sensibility whatsoever. So we say thank you to Harlan for creating places like this. But I also now will close by saying, to the extent you are thinking about something you would like to do during America 250 to preserve American heritage for generations to come, Doug has brought with him my friend Amy Turcott, who's right here in the yellow, who is the Director of Development at Mount Vernon. And I can't think of a better, more impactful gift to say thank you to our great American history and its preservation than by supporting Mount Vernon, which Claire and I have been doing for years. And it's just, and when you go, you'll say, no, I want to be a part of this. I want to be a part of this. So I encourage you to at least think about that. And with that, we will close the program. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Very well done.
Listening to Doug Bradburn's views on the importance of George Washington, the man who was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen, is a great way to prepare for the celebration of America 250 on the 4th of July. Make sure you catch all my podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud, the Washington Independent Review of Books website, and now the Dallas Morning News is publishing and promoting my podcast. Until next time, remember the words of my late great friend, Bobby Bragan, you can't hit the ball with the bat on your shoulders. It's Talmage Boston. Thanks for listening.